Welcome back to our histology unit. We're picking up with part 2 with the connective tissues. With the connective tissues, they're going to be determined by their location. So there'll be things like fat, blood, bone, ligaments, tendons, and cartilage. The function of connective tissue is to bind, support, protect, and serve as a framework for the body. It's also going to fill spaces between different cells and different tissues. It's going to store fat, produce blood cells, protect against infection, and repair damaged tissues. Major characteristics, back up here, are going to be surrounded by an extracellular matrix. It's going to have fibers and ground substances within that extracellular matrix. It's going to have a good blood vessel supply, except for with the cartilage and dense connective tissue. Those are not going to have a good blood supply, so if you do damage those, then they will not repair themselves easily. So with those types of damage, lots of times you hear about people going in, for example, for knee surgery or for hip surgery. Oops, sorry. And they're derived from embryonic mesenchyme tissue. Now, structural elements of connective tissues. You're going to have 3 elements that you're going to find here. You're going to have the ground substance. That's going to be the substance that fills up that space. You're going to find fibers throughout and different types of cells. So you need to know these 3 elements that you're going to find. The composition and arrangement is going to vary depending on what type of connective tissue that we're talking about. So with the ground substance, we're going to have unstructured material that's going to fill a space between the cells. It could be a fluid, it could be a semi-fluid, or it could be gelatinous in nature. It can even be calcified. Just think of bone. Bone's going to be a connective tissue, and it calcifies and turns into a hard matrix. So it doesn't always have to be a fluid or a liquid, kind of like cytoplasm. So some components, it's going to be made up of water as one of its main components. It's going to have things such as gags. Now these gags are going to be glycosaminoglycogens, and these are going to be things such as hyaluronic acid. Hyaluronic acid is responsible for helping the skin. It brings water into the skin. It also gives skin flexibility and helps it stretch. You have things like chondroitin sulfate. Chondro, of course, you know, means cartilage, so it is found in the cartilage. It's going to provide structure. It helps hold water into the tissue and brings nutrients into the tissue. It also allows for other molecules to move through the cartilage. Then you have what's referred to as dermatitis sulfate. With a dermatitis sulfate, that's going to be a main component of tissues and organs. It's thought to be involved in wound repair. It helps with regulation of blood coagulation and response to infections. And the last one is going to be a keratin sulfate. With that keratin sulfate, that's going to be one of the major components of the cornea. It's going to help with the development of that clear, transparent tissue, and it's also going to help keep it maintenanced and repaired. With these gags, they're going to be made up of polysaccharides, so they're going to be long chains of sugars that are hooked together. They're going to trap water and help make the ground substance gelatinous. They're going to attach to peptidoglycans. They're also good with adhesion proteins like in fibronectin, so helping to bring things together and adhere them together. And those link components of that ground substance to the surface of cells. So looking here at a picture, we'll put this up top. You can see the different things. We have the hyaluronic acid strain going through here. So here's our hyaluronic acid coming through the center. You're going to have little link proteins that you see at the bases here. You have the keratin sulfate, which is going to be these smaller particles here. Then coming off of the hyaluronic acid, you see this protein, and the larger little filamentous structures are going to be the chondroitin sulfate, and that's going to be through here. Now, also looking over on the right-hand side of this picture, you see that you have your proteins that are going to be embedded throughout the cell membrane. So we see these different proteins here. You're going to see the microfilaments of the cytoskeleton, which help keep its shape and help keep the grounding of those filaments there. Coming off of the proteins, you're going to notice that you do have some peptidoglycans. And so these are going to be here. They can help with things like cell recognition. You also see your collagen fibers. So these are going to be big structural fibers that you'll have there. And here's another look at pretty much the same thing. Here you got your glycoprotein. Oops. Go back. Your glycoprotein here. And so you see that part's going to act as cell recognition. So cells that are constantly monitoring the system to see what belongs and what doesn't. Once it sees that, it's like a fingerprint and it knows that that cell belongs. Also throughout, you see the big, thick collagen fibers again coming through. So it's going to help with structure. Okay, 3 types of fibers associated with connective tissue. We talked about the collagenous fibers. These are going to be made up of collagen. These are going to be your strongest of all the fibers. They're going to add strength for holding body parts together, things such as tendons and ligaments. Tendons are going to hold muscle to bone. Ligaments hold bone to bone. The elastic fibers are going to be our next type of fiber. It's made of the protein elastin. It's going to be very stretchy. It helps add flexibility to certain types of connective tissue. And so you're going to find these in places like the skin, blood vessels, and lung tissue. All of those need to be able to stretch and to be able to bounce back into place without any type of damage. And then our third type is going to be reticular fibers. Reticular fibers are going to be thin, collagenous fibers that are going to form supportive networks in blood vessel walls and in other tissues. Major cell types. You have your fibroblasts. These are going to be large star-shaped cells which produce fibers that are deposited into the matrix of the connective tissue. Fibroblasts are also the type of cell that you find in areas where you've had some tissue damage and it actually scars. These will come from the fibroblast cells. Macrophages are going to be cells that constantly wander and roam throughout the different tissues, and they're actually looking for things that don't belong. So they're looking for microorganisms such as viruses and bacteria, maybe a parasite that might have gotten in. And so they look for those things and they remove those particles. They also remove anything like dead or worn out organelle particles that it might find. And they're going to do this by wrapping themselves around it. They bring it into the body and then they destroy it using things such as their lysosomes. Mast cells are probably one that you're dealing with right now. These are going to be located near blood vessels and connective tissue. What they do is they prevent blood from clotting and they promote inflammation or swelling. Sometimes this is going to be a good thing and we need swelling. We need extra blood going to certain areas. It's also, however, going to be associated with allergies. These are the cells that activate more histamine production. Histamine is going to cause your body to create a lot of mucus in order to try to flush microorganisms out that don't belong. This, in turn, is going to make you feel miserable. It's going to give you that runny nose. It might give you watery eyes. It might cause some congestion in the eyes. And overall, you're just going to be very congested and kind of snotty. And so with these, you might take an antihistamine to try to turn some of that off or try to reduce the histamine that's being produced so you don't have as much nasal congestion. And then our white blood cells. These are going to be made up of things such as neutrophils, eosinophils, and lymphocytes. They're there to help find things that don't belong and work with the immune system to keep you healthy. The last type on here is the adipocytes. These are going to store fat. So these are fat cells. Fat tissue is going to be referred to as adipose. All right, so looking at these different types. There we go. So we have our macrophage here. Remember with that one, it's constantly searching for things that don't belong. We have our fibroblast here, which is going to create the fibers that you're going to find throughout connective tissue and also can create scar tissue. You have a lymphocyte here that's going to work with the immune system. You have your fat cell here. That's going to be an adipocyte. And if you put several together, you have the tissue. It's called adipose tissue. You have this mast cell here is creating histamine. It's going to cause swelling and inflammation. And then you have neutrophils. They're going to work with the other white blood cells and help fight infections. And over here we have our ground matrix. So notice the collagen fibers are going to be a lot thicker. The elastin fibers are going to be somewhere in the middle, very stretchy. And then you have the reticular fibers, which are made of collagen, but they're going to be very thin. So classification of mature connective tissue, you're going to have loose connective tissue, dense connective tissue, cartilage, bone, and then liquid. So the first type we're going over is going to be a type of loose connective tissue, and we refer to this type as areolar connective tissue. It's going to be composed of mainly fibroblast embedded in a gelatinous or gel-like matrix of collagenous and elastic fibers. Its function is to hold and nourish epithelial cells. This next one should be very easy in order for you to identify. It has so it's going to have the main cell membrane coming around the edge. That's going to act as the ring, and this one's going to be referred to as a signet ring, which is a ring with a stone on top. It's going to have the nucleus off to the side. That's going to be the stone part. And then the center throughout here is going to be filled with lipid droplets. So depending on how much lipid it takes in, it can grow in size or it can shrink in size. They're going to act kind of like sponges. And so the more you eat that gets stored as fat, those cells can expand in size. They won't go through mitosis and create more. They just simply expand. Or if you've been exercising a lot, you've been cutting back on what you eat, it can actually go in and use the lipid droplets inside and actually cause those cells to shrink in size. So they're referred to as a signet ring because that fat droplet pushes that nucleus off to the side. And so this is going to be your adipose tissue. So it's composed of cells that store fat droplets or lipid droplets. They function to protect, and so they're going to cushion organs, they're going to insulate the body, and they store some of that extra fat for energy. It's going to be located in places like the hypodermis. That's going to be the layer of skin that's just below the epidermis and dermis. It's also going to be found in places like the back of the eyeballs and in surrounding joints. So looking at this picture here, this is going to be reticular connective tissue. It's another type of loose connective tissue that you'll see here. And of course it has reticular fibers and it's going to have nucleus of those reticuli. It's going to be composed of a gel-like matrix, the reticular fibers. It's going to have some fibroblasts in there. You can find some white blood cells, some mast cells, and some macrophages. They're going to be located in places like the spleen, the bone marrow, and the lymph nodes. This next type of tissue should be easy to identify because you're going to look for these waves. The waves are going to give it away. They're going to be thick collagenous fibers with fibroblasts embedded in between. This is going to be referred to as your dense connective tissue. It's going to be packed very tightly together. That's where it gets its name. So it's composed of very few fibroblasts that are surrounded by closely packed collagenous fibers and elastic fibers. It's going to function to make strong tissues able to withstand a pulling force. Places that you're going to find this are going to be like the tendons, ligaments, and the sclera, which is going to be the white part of the eye. Looking at this here, you see the descriptions primarily parallel collagen fibers. You're going to have a few elastin fibers. Major cell type is going to be the fibroblast that you're going to find here, and those are the ones that kind of, you see the main nuclei there in them. Their function, like we said, is to attach muscle to bone or to other muscles, and those are going to be your tendons. It attaches bone to bone. That's going to be your ligaments. It withstands great tensile stress when pulling force is applied in one direction. And so it shows you in the picture a couple of different places where these are found. An aponeurosis or aponeuroses are going to be tendons or sheet-like tendons that attach muscle to muscle. With our next type, this is called connective tissue proper, and it's going to be a dense connective tissue. This one is slightly different from the other one that we saw. This one is going to have these elastic fibers that go through it, so there's not going to be those really thick collagen fibers like we just saw. With this one, it's going to contain a high portion, we said, of those elastic fibers. It allows recoil of tissue following stretching, and so it's going to maintain a pulsating flow for blood through arteries. It's going to aid in passive recoil of the lungs following inspiration, which means breathing in, and expiration is breathing out. And so where you'll find this, you're going to find this in places under a lot of pressure and places that have to be able to stretch and then come back in. And so you have that in the aorta, which is your largest and main artery of the body, and you'll have it in the lung tissue. You can also find this associated with the vertebral column and within the walls of the bronchial tubes. The next one is going to be a connective tissue proper, referred to as dense connective tissue, but this one's irregular dense connective tissue. So notice how these collagen fibers are going to be going in all different directions. They're not going in a specific wave-like motion as the other dense regular connective tissue was. So with this one, it's primarily going to contain those collagen fibers. It has some elastic fibers in it, and the major cell type is still going to be a fibroblast that you see there. It's going to be able to withstand tension exerted in many directions, not just one, and it's going to provide structural strength. For this, you're going to find it in fibrous capsules of organs and joints. You'll find it on the dermis of the skin, which is underneath the epidermis, and you're going to find it in the submucosa of the digestive tract. The next type you're looking at is going to be cartilage. So these are chondrocytes there. They're composed of cartilage cells, chondrocytes, which are embedded in a gel-like matrix. There's three types of cartilage that we're going to talk about. Hyaline cartilage, which has a matrix composed of collagenous fibers. It's going to be located at the ends of bones, the rings around the trachea, and the tip of the nose. So if you push it in, it should bounce back. The next type we're going to go over is elastic cartilage. It's going to have a matrix composed of elastic fibers, which make it flexible, located in the external ears and in the larynx, which is your voice box. And your third type is going to be fibrocartilage. It's composed of a matrix of many collagenous fibers. It's going to be very tough. This is going to be located in your intervertebral disks, which are going to be the pads between each vertebrae, between bones in the knees, and the symphysis pubis, or depending on what book you have, it could be called the pubic symphysis. And that's going to be the cushion between the pelvic bones, or the coxa. The next type of connective tissue is very recognizable. You notice that it has these circles that you see throughout. The lamellae are going to be circles kind of like tree rings. With those, they're going to have circles that are embedded in them. Okay, so these circles inside are going to be openings called lacunae. Inside the lacunae, you're going to find a mature bone cell called an osteocyte. In the center of these structures, you're going to have an opening which allows blood vessels to go through and nerves to go through. They're called Haversian canals. These little radiating lines that you see going between each one of those osteocytes from lamellae over to the next are going to be referred to as canaliculi. Those are going to allow cytoplasmic extensions between one osteocyte to the next so they can exchange nutrients and different things that they might share. So bone's going to be composed, like we said, of the mature bone cell, which is going to be the osteocyte. It's surrounded by a matrix of collagenous fibers, and then they're going to have mineral salts placed on them. So that's what's actually going to make it hard. If you don't have those collagen fibers there, there will be nothing to place that actual hard part of the bone onto. And that's actually going to be made up of calcium carbonate and calcium phosphate. And of course, located in the bones. And the function of the bones is to protect, to support, and to give strength. The next type of connective tissue is going to be blood. So looking here, this is what red blood cells look like underneath the microscope. So A is going to be an artist rendition, and B is going to be what it actually looks like. The purple cells that you see throughout are going to be white blood cells. So I'll move that down. And then the cell fragments that you see are going to be platelets. So that's what's actually going to help plug up any type of damage that you might have in tissues and stop the bleeding. So blood's going to be composed of cells, both white blood cells, red blood cells, and platelets. Sometimes you'll see them shortened to WBCs for white blood cells and RBCs for red blood cells. They're going to be suspended in a fluid matrix called the blood plasma. The function is going to be able to transport substances to and from all body cells. So looking here, you see a red blood cell on top. Notice that it is biconcave, so it's going to be actually going in on both sides. There is no nucleus in the center. It starts out with a nucleus when it's immature, but once it starts to mature, it's reticulocyte. It expels the nucleus, and then it no longer has one. Below, you're going to see the different types of white blood cells, and we'll go into each type in more detail when we get into the immune system and into blood. And then at the bottom, you're going to see platelets. So these are your three main formed elements that you're going to find in your blood. Covering and lining membranes. These are going to be composed of at least two primary types. We're going to have epithelium bound to underlying connective tissue proper. These are going to be around simple organs. And we have four types. We have a cutaneous membrane, a mucous membrane, serous, and synovial. With the cutaneous membrane, it's going to be basically the skin. It comprises of the integumentary system, a stratified squamous epithelium with underlying connective tissue that keeps it in place. This will be a dry membrane, so it's going to be referred to as a keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. And so here's a picture giving an example of the cutaneous membrane. Next is our mucous membranes, often referred to as the mucosa. These are going to line body cavities that open to the outside. So, for example, the digestive tracts and the respiratory tracts. So they'll line the mouth, nose, and throat. They may secrete mucus. And here they are. And so you see the mucosa lining the mouth, the nose, the throat. Comes down the trachea. So we see it coming down the trachea, goes down the back, the esophagus is behind. Notice how it lines the airways and the lungs. Continues down the esophagus, surrounds the stomach, goes into the small intestine, and that would be your intestinal mucosa. Serous membranes are going to be made up of simple squamous connective tissue that rests on a thin layer of areolar tissue. It's going to line internal body cavity walls. You have what's referred to as the visceral serosa, which is the actual part that's near the organ. It's going to secrete a serous fluid between the two layers, which reduces friction. And it's going to form an inner cavity linings and covers organs of the thorax and abdomen. And so here's what it looks like. So you have the parietal peritoneum, which is going to be towards the walls of the body cavity, and the visceral peritoneum, which is going to be the inner portion that's actually close to the organs. Over to the side, you see we have it surrounding the lungs. So you'll have the outer portion towards the walls of the body, which is the parietal pleura. The portion of the lungs, or the portion of the membrane that's towards the lungs, is going to be the visceral pleura. And then looking at the pericardium that wraps around the heart, the portion that's close to the heart is going to be the visceral pericardium. And the portion that's going to be on the outer section is the parietal pericardium. Now, in between all of these, notice that there is an open pericardial space or an open pleural space. That is going to be where you find the actual fluid. So synovial membranes are going to be composed entirely of connective tissue. These are going to line joint cavities. So looking here, right? So you'll have synovial fluid in between. Sometimes these joints can become inflamed. They get more fluid in them and actually cause swelling and a lot of pain. There's a synovial membrane, which kind of encapsulates it and covers it. And this is what is actually going to keep these two ends of the bone together. Moving on to our next type of connective tissue is muscle tissue. It's going to be located in skeletal muscle, heart, blood vessels, and surrounding digestive organs. The function is to contract or shorten to create movement. Major characteristics is it's going to contain protein fibers that shorten under the control of nerves and good blood supply. We're going to go into these actual fibers of actin and myosin later on. And you're going to have three types of this type of muscle tissue. You have skeletal muscle, which is what you think of when you think of muscle tissue. That's what you would flex, or that's what's going to get you around when you walk. You have smooth muscle, which is going to line hollow organs and is going to surround things like blood vessels, the esophagus, the intestines. These are going to work with a motion or a movement called peristalsis that moves things through them. And then you're going to have cardiac muscle, and that's the muscle that's going to be found in the heart. Looking at the first one, you should be able to identify right off it has lines. These lines are referred to as striations. That's going to be made up of proteins that we're going to talk about. Each muscle cell could be referred to as a muscle fiber, so interchange muscle cell and muscle fiber. Same thing. This type of muscle cell is actually going to have multiple nuclei in it, so it's called a multinucleate. Because it's a multinucleate, because it's striated, and because it's long cylinders, you should know that this one's going to be skeletal muscle tissue. So composed of many parallel rows of string-like cells with alternating light and dark striations. Think of striations and striped. Its functions to move bones. So it is voluntary. You do need to know that. It is under your control, so you can get up and move around anytime you want to. The next type is called a spindle-shaped cell. This is going to be your smooth muscle. With this type, you have one nucleus inside, so it's going to be a uninucleate. There are no striations that you can see, and these are going to be the ones that you cannot control, so they're involuntary. And that specific shape you see up there is referred to as a spindle shape. Its functions to move food through the digestive tract, to empty the bladder of urine, and to contract the uterus during childbirth. And the last type. This is going to be your cardiac muscle, and it's going to look like the skeletal muscle, except it is a uninucleate, so there's only going to be one nucleus per cell. These branch, along with being cylindrical, they'll branch and go in different ways. They'll have a darker section that separates these cells. And so these sections here that you'll see throughout, those are referred to as intercalated disks. These are going to be gap junctions that allow chemical signals to go from one cell to the next, or electrical signals from one cell to the next to communicate and to send things like contractions on down through the cells. Oops. So it's composed of branching, striated muscle cells, functions to make the heart pump blood. They're involuntary, and they're uninucleates. Right. Going into the nervous tissue. The nervous tissue is going to be made up of two specific types of cells. You have your neurons, which are going to be the main nerves, and then you're going to have supporting cells, which are referred to as neuroglial cells. These are the ones who are going to help to make sure all the nutrients and all the things that these cells need, the neurons need, they actually get. Their function as neurons is to sense the environment, to think, to feel, to control the body's functions, and to control the movement. It's going to be located in the brain, the spinal cord, and the nerves. And so that's going to finish us up for this section of notes. I will see you again with our next section. If you have any questions, just let me know, and I'll see you later. Bye.